So today I want to talk to you about the impact of CT scanning data on across-flock evaluations. And the reason that I'm doing that is we've had some breeders that have come to us and they've questioned changes that they see in the NZTW when they have analyses where CT data have either been included or excluded, and they've compared between the two. And the things that they've observed are that the flock averages appear to increase even if only small numbers of animals are CT scanned. So there's a flock effect, and they also see that individual RAM index values increase by amounts that they believe are difficult to believe. You know, it seems too good to be true. So there's a flock difference and in individual RAMs that can appear to be extreme. So we've had a look at the data. We've just finished revising the cell-meat module, and that's been implemented, and so it's timely to have a look if there is CT bias that we can see in the latest version of the analysis that's going out. So how can we investigate if there is some kind of systematic bias that CT is causing in our results? We were able to go and access a number of flocks and say that have CT data in them, and so we've been able to compare the indexes and breeding values from some across-flock analyses where in these groups. And the ones that we selected one where that we used selected flocks from a large group breeding scheme, where some of their members use CT scanning and others don't. So it's a nice way to be able to compare those. And also we found that there was an individual flock that we had that has been doing CT scanning for a number of years, but they've never actually based any of their selection decisions on that CT data. So that's a really great data set that we wouldn't have been able to generate ourselves, where we can actually see what CT does in the absence of basing their selection decisions on it. And just a reminder that we're doing this on the revised cell-meat module breeding values, not the ones that we used prior to September 2018. So if we look at our first flock, and this is the one where they've collected CT data and done quite a good job of that, but they haven't based it in any of their selection decisions. And so looking at the structure of this flock, they've had what I would call very good practice for CT scanning. By that I mean that they have done a large number of ram lambs each year, and a good number per sire that they were using in their flock, and that they have CT scanned animals from all sires. And in addition to that, they basically had quite random picks. They randomly picked progeny rather than picking the very top performing ones. So it's almost a scientific experiment in terms of its design. It's a really good example to look at. And just a reminder that they didn't actually use any of the CT scanning in their selection decisions. It was excluded from their selection decisions. And so I'll just spend a little bit of time explaining what this graph is, so that we can move through the rest a bit quicker. But what we've got is, this is the revised New Zealand terminal worth here and here, but on this scale here, CT data are excluded, and that index is in cents. And here we've got the same thing, but the CT data is included. Now I've drawn onto all of these graphs this line here on the 45 degrees, and that's the point where this index and this index are equivalent. So if it's minus 1,000 cents here, it's minus 1,000 cents here, and if it's plus 2,000 cents here, it's the same value here. And if there was no difference between the two indexes, then all of those dots would be sitting right on that line. Now that's not the case. When we look, what does the CT data do? It's actually made some changes. So here, animals have moved up, they've improved because CT data have been added, but equally, there are an equal number of animals that have dropped in index value as a result of having CT data in there. So some have gone up, some have gone down, and some have gone up by quite a lot. If we look at this individual here, it's gone up by almost 300 index points, which is a pretty substantial change, and this animal here has dropped by a pretty substantial amount. Now, this is an animal here that has probably CT scanned quite well itself, and it's probably got some relatives that have CT scanned well in order to move it that far. Most animals have not changed by that much, but all animals have changed to some degree. But we see equal amounts going up and down, which is exactly what we would suggest that CT would do if we were just doing that for an individual year. Now, we're not doing that for an individual year. This has been done over quite a few years. So the second graph, what I've done is I've overlaid a colour that shows the older animals and the younger animals. So here's our scale here. In red, our the oldest animals were born in 1990, and so they're bright red, and our newest animals were born in 2017, and they're blue. And what we see is that our red animals tend to be very close to that 45-degree line, and they're also in the lower part of this graph. So our blue animals, there's a bit more spread in them, and they're in the higher part of this graph here. So what it's saying is that this breeder has been making good improvement in New Zealand terminal worth, so they've been moving it up in this direction. They've improved it here and here, so they've been driving them up. But as they've collected CT scanning data, we see more variation. So in the early days, there was very little CT data or no CT data on those animals. In the animals that they've CT scanned, they're able to pick the true variation that's there, and so we see a lot of movement over time. So what does that actually, the genetic trends graph is a better way to look at that. So what does the genetic trends graph look like for this flock? So we've got, hopefully all the breeders are familiar with looking at these. We've got birth year along here. We've got the terminal worth up here from the revised CILMET module, and we've got our dashed line, which is excluding CT data, so we've got that here, and then our solid blue, which includes CT data. And while there are times when one line is a little above the other or vice versa, in actual fact there's been no difference that's been made in this flock. So back in the 1990s, they were around about 100 index points in cents. They've gained through here as they've made genetic progress, but in 2017 they're at exactly the same point at around about 850 index points. So this flock has been doing a good job of improving maternal worth, but CT scanning has not been part of that. There's no benefit that they've gained from the cost of CT scanning those animals. So the second flock, so there we go, no difference in trend between the 1990 and 2017. They've just tracked along together to all intents and purposes. If we look at our second flock, this flock is now from a group breeding scheme. Once again, we're looking at New Zealand terminal worth, and this flock has used CT scanning. They've done quite good practice, CT scanned lots of ram lambs from all of their sires, and they have used that data in their selection decisions. So it's exactly the same as our previous one, except they've actually used the CT data in making their decisions. And what we see is here's our 45-degree line. Up in this part here, our values have moved off it. So in our index that includes CT, these animals that are at the upper end of the index are all up above that line, which looks like we've got some kind of bias that's creeping in here. And so this is probably what our breeders have seen and are commenting on. If we just overlay our colours, this is exactly the same graph, but we've just got our age structure on here. If you have a look at our red animals, they are all sitting on that line. So the early animals were sitting right on that 45-degree line when there was very little CT data. But as we've selected, our newer animals have moved up. So there's an overall trend that we're moving up in this direction off that line, and we're selecting animals that are better, or at least the index is saying better. So we're seeing a response to selection here that's moved the whole flock up off that line. And there are some individuals that have moved a little bit more than others, but we're picking them up and moving them in this direction up off that line. Now, where's this coming from? We can look at the individual component breeding values that are going into this index, and so I've picked four to talk about. The first one is weaning weight. So we just got the same kind of graph here, but this time we're only looking at our weaning weight BV without CT and with CT. And all of our values are sitting right on that 45-degree line. You can see we've got our red animals down here, so the older animals have lower breeding values for weaning weight, and our newer animals have higher, but CT is not really having any impact on the weaning weight breeding value, and we'd expect that. You know, the weaning weight breeding value, all animals are measured for it, and so we're kind of getting the response that we would expect there. The next one to look at is carcass weight. And if we have a look, most of our animals are pretty close. There is a very small hint at the top end that we're getting a bit of spread in carcass weight as a result of having some CT data, and that's kind of to be expected. But it's pretty small, so we're not getting too much. There's a little bit of movement above the line here, but pretty much they're sitting there, a bit more movement than weaning weight, but not a massive amount of this change is coming from differences in carcass weight BB between the two. Where there are differences coming are from a yield traits. I'm just going to show the hind quarter, but the same trend works for the loin and the shoulder as well. So this is HQLY, which is the hind quarter, the hind leg lean yield. So that's the weight of meat on a 19 kilogram carcass. So it's adjusted for carcass weight. And so what we see here is we've got our age structure on again. Our early animals are sitting right on that line, and you can see that some animals have gone up from having CT data and some have gone down. But as we've got newer animals, as birth year has gone on, we're seeing that whole thing move up above, and so we're getting a response to selection. These have been selected to increase our hindquarter lean yield, and so these animals have moved up off that line. If we have I should just say that the same situation holds the similar looking graph for loin yield and for shoulder yield. So we're seeing that we're increasing the weight of meat. There's a bigger spread of BBs here than there is here, and we're increasing that. And so we would expect that if we're basing our selection on it, we should see some kind of response to selection. This is this one here is fat yield, and interestingly, we've got our red animals, our old animals sitting right on that line, but our younger animals are moving now in this direction. They're being driven down. Now, the reason for that is that once again, this is response to selection. In our terminal worth index, there's a negative value on fat. So if we're improving our animals, we're selecting them to have a lower yield of fat, less fat per unit of carcass weight. And so what we're seeing is that they're driving it down here. So in both cases, in the lean yield and in the fat yield, they're moving in the direction that our economic weights for those traits would drive them if the breeder is selecting based on them. Now, there's a negative here for fat, but it's got that will have a positive weighting. So both of those are contributing to lift our newer animals, the ones that have responded to selection, up off this line. So once again, let's look at the genetic trends graph, because it shows this probably better than looking at the different colours. And what we see is that this flock started CT scanning in 2005, so that's the first year that we see a divergence between our lines. Here's our selection if we don't take into account the CT scanning, and you can see that they're still improving this flock, but when we add the CT data each year, they're getting that incremental gain from having CT in there. And so this trend just gets wider and wider as we track up here. And that difference is at a peak here that's just roughly the same here, just slightly smaller. There's a difference of 223 cents in 2016. So if we had a look, this flock, any rams in that would jump up by an average of 223 cents off that line. That sounds like a massive amount, but when we take it over 12 years, that's only an improvement of 19 cents per year, which is believable from a meat yield point of view. So while there will be individuals that jump by more than that because they are better than average, and there'll be individuals that don't go by quite as much, but they will all be tracking above this line here for individual rams. So while it sounds like a lot, that's perfectly believable when you say, well, this flock has been selecting for 12 years, they've been collecting and doing a good job with their measurements, and they've got the genetic gain that you would expect as a result of that. So now let's look at a flock, flock 3 here, where they have used only a little bit of CT data. They've only CT scanned 6 animals in this case, and that data has been included in, some of that data has been included in selection, or that data has been used in their selection decisions. So here's the graph for terminal worth that we're used to looking at now with our age color gradient put on. What we see is there are differences here, but they're a lot less extreme than the flock that we looked at, where they did a lot of CT scanning. So here's our 45-degree line. There are changes, and most of the time those animals are above the line. So CT has not said that there are equal numbers above and below, but it said that most of the animals that we've CT scanned are better. We'll look at the components that make up that again. Once again, weaning weight and carcass weight didn't really contribute much to that. So we're just going to look at our hindquarter lean yield and our fat yield. Here's our hindquarter yield. So this flock doesn't actually do many measurements other than that contribute to meat yield, other than the small number that have been CT scanned. And so we don't have very much of a spread in our hindquarter. There's not a lot of traits that are driving much difference there. But for our animals that were CT scanned, they've all resulted in quite an improvement. So we're lifting our BV up quite a lot. So it's driving selection up in this direction for these animals. And you can see family bands here where individuals that are related to the animal that was scanned, that they've improved as well. But they've improved in the direction of selection where we said that they're better animals. Likewise for fat, not as much variation as we saw in the previous flock, but our old animals sit right on that line. Our newer animals have moved in the direction of selection, which is against fat. And so we've got one ram here with his relatives that are very good for leanness, not much fat, and some others that are similar, but they are all below that line and in that direction. So they haven't moved as much, but they have been quite positive in terms of the gain that they have made. If we have a look at the genetic trends graph for that, you can see that this flock started scanning much later. 2011 is where we see the first difference, but the average difference is not very much. The difference is only 17 cents in 2017, which is a gain of only 2.4 cents per year. Again, some individual rams would increase by a little bit more than this, but not too much. So this flock, it's CT scanned some rams that have been used in recent years, and so they've benefited from the gain in CT from their flock, but more likely from linked flocks. But because they've only scanned so few, they've got very little difference that's going through there. So small amount of CT scanning, small response, but because gains have been made in that breed group, then they are getting some benefit, albeit a pretty small one from that. So we looked at a number of other flocks, but they all follow this similar trend. All of those values are kind of in line with the direction that we would expect things to go. The changes in some cases were substantial, but given the period of time, then they're believable. So just to summarize, CT scanning is still a good way that we can increase our rate of gain in our meat traits, but you have to use that data. So in that flock that collected it but didn't use it, you see that there was no benefit. If you collected and used that, then you can get very good rates of gain that are above the levels that you would get if you don't have CT scanning in there. The responses that we see to selection are in line with those that we would expect over time when people are using CT. So I've said it several times, but while those responses seem large, over time they are in line with the kind of responses that we would predict given the improvement in accuracy that we know that CT data has. So when you actually calculate it out over 12 years at 19 cents per year, that is perfectly believable. When you suddenly turn that on and off in the analysis, you're seeing hundreds of cents difference. But that's believable given the rates, given the length of time that some flocks have been selecting on the basis of that information. So I've said here that, so we're not seeing evidence that there is systematic bias due to having CT data in a cross-flock analysis. Bias is a politically charged word, and so what it's indicating is that there is some kind of unfair advantage that's coming from using that. The breeding values that we're getting with CTN are more accurate, as are the breeding values that we have for Viascan. It's a very similar story where Viascan data is being used. So I wouldn't call this bias. I think that this is a reflection that we're seeing more accurate results coming from using the CT data. And so that those differences are true. When we look at it, the reasons are there to justify it. So that raises the question, if you're in a cross-flock evaluation, should you have the CT data in or should you exclude it? And really that comes down to the choice of the breed group. Some breed groups like to compare their analyses with measurements that everybody in the group have. Others want to use all of the information so that they have the most accurate breeding values. My personal preference is that CT data is put in because then you've got the most accurate breeding values, all of the flocks benefit from having that data in, but the flocks that are selecting on that will get a greater benefit because they've spent more money, they're getting the benefit, getting more accurate breeding values, and they're using it. If you're in a breed society and you're CT scanning and the breed society doesn't want to use the CT data, as I said, that's the breed society's choice, but if you're a breeder who is CT scanning, then my recommendation to you is very strongly to, when you actually make your own decisions, then make sure you have CT data in that analysis so that you get the benefit of using it and get the best picks. You may well be, you use the crossbreed analysis to benchmark your animals on a less accurate basis, but use the CT data in your own selections when you're picking those animals so that you get the benefit of using it and doing it. So just to summarise one last time, we're not seeing a systematic bias that's coming from CT in the new module. The kind of changes that we're seeing are in line with the response to selection that we would expect over time. So there are very good gains to be made from using CT if you think that you can afford that cost and can benefit from it in your own flock. Thanks very much.